Some disasters kill with one blow. Lisbon was killed with 3. A massive earthquake tore through the city without warning. A tsunami swept into the harbor and drowned those who had escaped the falling stone. Then fire consumed what was left. On November 1st, 1755, a thriving European capital was transformed into chaos, ruin, and mass death. It was a chain reaction of terror that killed tens of thousands, shattered a capital, and left all of Europe trying to understand how a city so powerful could be erased in a single day. Lisbon was the jewel of the Atlantic. It was a city of gold, incense, and stone. As the capital of the Portuguese Empire, it was one of the wealthiest cities on the planet. A labyrinth of narrow medieval streets, towering cathedrals, and palaces that held the riches of 3 continents. It was a city that felt eternal, a city built on the bedrock of faith and the certainty of stone. By sunset, the stone was rubble. The gold was melting in a firestorm that could be seen for 40 miles. And the faith of the Enlightenment was drowning in 30 feet of salt water. The earth didn't just shake, it rearranged the definition of the world. This is the story of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, the disaster that proved that the geometry of safety is often just a different way of describing a trap. Welcome to Geofall. To understand how a city of 250,000 people can be dismantled in an hour, you have to understand the layout of the environment. Lisbon in 1755 was a masterpiece of the trap. The city was a dense, vertical maze. The streets were often no wider than a cart, flanked by 5-story buildings made of heavy, unreinforced limestone. And there was the date, November 1st, All Saints' Day. In 18th century Portugal, this was not just a holiday. It was a mandatory, city-wide event. Every one of Lisbon's 40 churches and 90 convents was packed to the rafters. Tens of thousands of people were squeezed into high-ceilinged stone naves, surrounded by the only thing that could make the architecture more dangerous: fire. Every altar was lit with hundreds of tallow candles. Every home had a small brazier burning for the holiday feast. It was a city of wood and stone, filled with people, and lit like a funeral pyre. It was a lumber yard waiting for a spark, and a quarry waiting for a vibration. 9:40 a.m. The shaking didn't start with a bang. It started with a low, guttural roar that survivors said sounded like heavy wagons being driven at high speed over cobblestones. But there were no wagons. The epicenter was nearly 200 miles away, deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean on the Azores-Gibraltar Transform Fault. It was a massive rupture, likely a magnitude 8.5 or higher. An event so powerful, it sent shockwaves that were felt from Greenland to North Africa. When the primary waves hit Lisbon, the physics of stone became the first killer. Limestone is remarkably strong under vertical pressure. It can hold up a cathedral for centuries. But like the cast iron pipes in 1923 Tokyo or the mud brick walls of Kumis, it has almost no tolerance for lateral movement. It does not flex. It snaps. Inside the great cathedrals, the Sé, the Basilica of San Vicente de Fora, the high vaulted ceilings began to sway. In a normal earthquake, you might have 30 seconds of shaking. This lasted for 6 minutes. Imagine 6 minutes of the ground turning into a liquid. Imagine the massive stone arches, weighing hundreds of tons, being pulled apart by the very gravity that usually holds them together. The people inside the churches did what instinct told them to do. They knelt. They prayed. They stayed exactly where they were, beneath the highest topographic points in the city. It was the first fatal mistake. The naves collapsed inward. The heavy stone roofs didn't just fall, they pulverized everything beneath them. In the Church of San Domingos alone, thousands were crushed in seconds as the roof pancaked into the sanctuary. Outside, the dust was so thick it turned 10 a.m. into midnight. Survivors stumbled through the ruins, their lungs filled with the pulverized remains of their own homes. But the earthquake was only the first act. As the buildings collapsed, the thousands of candles lit for All Saints' Day hit the dry timber of the floorboards and the tapestries on the walls. It was the same downfall equation seen in Tokyo. Hundreds of simultaneous ignitions across miles of continuous fuel. Because the streets were so narrow, the heat couldn't escape. It fanned out. A firestorm began to move through the ruins of the lower city. The people who had survived the collapse were now being hunted by the air itself. They did what made sense. They fled the heat. They fled the falling stone. They looked for the largest open space available. In Lisbon, that space was the Terreiro do Pacho, the palace square, right on the edge of the Tagus River. Thousands of people, many of them bleeding, many carrying what little they could save, crowded onto the riverfront. They looked at the burning city behind them and felt the cool breeze from the Atlantic. They believed they had found the one place the fire and the falling stone couldn't reach. That is when they noticed the water. Like the survivors in Shimabara in 1792 or the coast of Japan in 2011, the people on the Lisbon docks saw something impossible. The Tagus River was disappearing. The water was receding so fast and so far that the riverbed was exposed. Ancient shipwrecks, lost for decades, were suddenly visible in the mud. The ships anchored in the harbor were tilting over on their sides as the bottom of the estuary was scoured dry. To the people on the shore, this looked like a miracle. A path was opening. Some people actually walked out onto the exposed mud, curious, looking for treasures, or simply moving further away from the heat of the burning city. They didn't know the physics of the refraction. They didn't know that when the seafloor drops or jumps 200 miles away, the displacement of water has to go somewhere. The ocean hadn't left. It was just drawing back a fist. About 40 minutes after the earthquake, the first wave arrived. It wasn't a clean, white-capped wave from a postcard. It was a black wall of debris, mud, and raw kinetic energy. In the narrow funnel of the Tagus estuary, the water had nowhere to go but up. It hit the Terreiro do Pacho at 20 miles per hour. A tsunami doesn't just flood. It scours. It turns the very things you think are safe, the docks, the ships, the stone walls, into battering rams. The thousands of people standing on the riverfront, convinced they were in the safest spot in the city, were swept away in seconds. The water surged nearly 400 feet inland, drowning the lower districts and extinguishing the fires in the most brutal way possible, by replacing the oxygen with salt water. 3 waves hit the city. Each one was a different height, a different rhythm of destruction. By the time the third wave receded, the lower city of Lisbon had been sanitized of its history. Here is the part that haunts the records of 1755. Survival that day had nothing to do with faith, and everything to do with altitude and the timing of your decisions. In the high district of Alfama, built on solid rock and far above the river, many people survived. The ground shook, but it didn't liquefy. The fire moved through, but the stone stayed standing. In the lower Baixa district, the opposite was true. Those who ran to the river died in the water. Those who stayed in the streets died in the fire. Those who stayed in the churches died under the stone. It was a triple cascade catastrophe. If the earthquake didn't get you, the fire did. If you outran the fire, the ocean was waiting. The death toll is estimated between 60,000 and 100,000. It was so high that they couldn't bury the dead. To prevent plague, the bodies were loaded onto barges, taken out to sea, and dumped with stones tied to their feet. The city that had spent the morning celebrating the saints spent the evening being fed to the Atlantic. But the 1755 Lisbon earthquake did something else. It ended the old world. In 1755, the prevailing logic was that disasters were messages. If a city fell, it was because the city was sinful. But the thinkers of the Enlightenment, men like Voltaire and Rousseau, looked at Lisbon and saw a problem. Why did the earthquake hit on a holy day? Why did it destroy the cathedrals but leave the brothels in the red light district of Alfama standing? Why did it kill thousands of innocent children in the act of prayer? The geometry of faith no longer made sense. The Prime Minister of Portugal, the Marquis of Pombal, didn't care about the theology. He had a ruined city to manage. When asked what was to be done, he famously said, "Bury the dead and heal the living." He did more than that. He reinvented the city. He hired engineers to build pombaline structures, buildings designed with a wooden internal frame called the gaiola, or the cage. It was a flexible wooden skeleton built inside the stone walls. It was the first seismic-resistant architecture in the world. He tested the designs by having soldiers march in rhythm around models of the buildings to simulate tremors. He mandated wide streets and fire breaks. He moved the city's defense from the manual of prayer to the manual of engineering. The 1755 earthquake was the birth of modern seismology. For the first time, a government sent out a survey to every parish in the country, asking, how long did the shaking last? Which way did the cracks face? Did the sea rise or fall first? They were looking for patterns. They were trying to understand the physics of the trap before it closed again. Today, Lisbon is a vibrant, beautiful city. You can walk through the Baixa and see the perfectly straight, wide avenues that Pombal designed. You can see the ruins of the Carmo convent, left roofless as a permanent memorial to the morning the sky fell in. But the fault line is still there. The plates are still grinding. The tension is still building. The Alborz Mountains of Iran, the fault lines of Japan, and the Azores-Gibraltar Transform Fault all share the same cold mathematical indifference. The tragedy of 1755 wasn't just the candles or the stone. It was the belief that our structures, whether they are made of limestone or logic, are stronger than the planet they sit on. Every civilization makes the same wager, that the harbor will remain a harbor, that the earth beneath the walls will remain still, that the air above the streets will remain breathable. Most days that wager pays off, for decades, for centuries. Long enough for people to mistake luck for stability. But the world does not sign contracts with cities. Stone can fall, water can climb, air can fail. And when it does, all the confidence of an empire means nothing. You might be interested in my other documentaries, linked on the right. Don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.